Well, welcome everyone to the Antcliffe Memorial Lecture. My name's Alan Packwood. I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Churchill Archive Centre. Those of you who've been to these things before will know that my role on these occasions is normally giving housekeeping notices, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. If the fire alarms sound, take directions from the college staff and we'll all assemble outside by the Hepworth sculpture. If you have mobile phones, by all means use them to feature the event on social media, but can we ask you to turn them to silent and not to use flash if you take photographs. The college is recording today. Hopefully you've seen the notices, but we will not be recording the Q&A, so you're free to ask questions without fear of being caught on camera. But when it comes to the questions, please wait for the roving mic to come to you. Finally, you're all invited to a drinks reception afterwards in the college buttery. But if you're under 18, and we know some of you are, please don't ask for alcohol, because we will be checking some IDs. So, Churchill College and our master, Professor Sharon Peacock, are delighted to be hosting this event. The Antcliffe Memorial Lecture has become a sort of regular feature in the university calendar and now in the Churchill College calendar. And obviously it is a Polis lecture, the Department of Politics and International Studies. So it is great to be able to invite Professor Jude Brown, the head of that department, to introduce our speaker. A speaker, Baroness Ashton, who I'm delighted to say has just transferred her papers to the Churchill Archive Centre. Jude.
Welcome to this evening. As Alan kindly said, I'm Jude Brown. I'm Head of Department of Police here in Cambridge. This is the 10th annual John Antcliffe Memorial Lecture in British Politics. John Antcliffe came to Cambridge in 1979 to study history at Corpus Christi College. He was active in politics from a young age and served as chairman of the Cambridge University Conservative Association and was treasurer of the Cambridge Union while he was here as a student. After graduating, he pursued a successful career with Rothschilds before moving into the world of public relations. And in politics, he was the Conservative Borough Councillor. Well, following John Antcliffe's sudden death in 2010, a group of his friends and family, many of whom are here this evening and are very welcome, set up the John Antcliffe Fund, which generously supports both this annual lecture on British politics and a bi-fellowship at the Churchill Archives, Churchill Archive Centre for a visiting scholar who works on political, economic and social history of the Thatcher era. So previous speakers in this lecture series included Lord Hague last year, who's now become Chancellor of Oxford University, and Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, who's now leading the government's Strategic Defence Review. And this evening, I'm delighted to be welcoming Baroness Ashton of Holland. Catherine Ashton served as the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy from 2009 to 2014. Holds several portfolios in foreign and security policy. She's a distinguished fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and a consultant to the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. As a member of the House of Lords, she serves as the European Affairs Committee member and chairs the Space and UK Committee. On behalf of the UN Security Council, she chaired the negotiations that ultimately resulted in the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. She also worked with the Prime Ministers of Serbia and Kosovo, leading to the Brussels Agreement, for which she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Previously, she was the first female EU Commissioner for Trade between 2008 and 2009, and a UK government minister in the House of Lords. Until very recently, she was Chancellor of University of Warwick. As a junior minister, she worked for Tony Blair's administration for education and constitutional affairs, and she played a key role in the development of Sure Start and raising school standards. And she joined the cabinet as leader of the House of Lords when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister in 2007. So an absolutely astonishing career. This evening, Catherine is going to speak to us for about 30 to 40 minutes on challenges in UK foreign policy, and then we'll have time for some Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Ashton.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be here. And I do thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you. My favourite part is always the Q&A. So please do think what questions you'd like to ask. I've already talked to a few of the students, and they've promised me that they will ask questions because the world, as you may have noticed, keeps changing. I did check my phone before I came up to make sure things were as they were 10 minutes ago. By the time I finish, that may not be the case. I want to say, first of all, of course, that it's a great honour to give this 10th anniversary lecture. I never knew John Antcliffe, but I watched on YouTube the tribute that his dear friend, who also is a very good friend of mine, William Hague, gave last year. You know, in our funny world of politics, we often sit across the divide, finding ways that we can score points and get our ideas across by creating difference when sometimes really not very much exists, and other times where there are gaping chasms between us. But we also do come together to celebrate those who are prepared to devote themselves to public service, often in thankless ways. John stood as a parliamentary candidate in what might have been described as a no-hope seat. He worked tirelessly on his local council, where you don't get much glory. But these are such vital parts of the political landscape. And while I have a suspicion from everything I've read about him that he could have done more given greater opportunities, to have a lecture here in Cambridge in your name, well, it says quite a lot about just how special John was to his family and his friends, but also to our political world. So although he and I might not have agreed on very much when it came to politics, it really is a great privilege to be giving this lecture. When I started to think about what I would talk about a few months ago, well, there was quite a bit going on then. We had a US election in the offing. We were concerned about the direction that the war was taking in Ukraine. We had a Middle East in chaos. And in Sudan, we were witnessing the worst humanitarian catastrophe the world has ever seen, to mention just a few of the issues confronting us. Now we face the consequences of a US election, dramatic events that focus our minds on the future of Ukraine and of Europe, a Middle East no closer to resolution and peace, and terror and starvation facing Sudan. To not quite take a quote from Tony Blair, from the speech that he gave to the Labour Party conference 3 weeks or so after the terror of 9/11, he roughly said, "The kaleidoscope has turned. The pieces are tumbling and are reforming into a new pattern." The question that we all face is how much influence and choice we will have on what the new pattern looks like. We know that the UK is facing growing challenges. It's pretty obvious. But there are false choices that pit so-called domestic issues against foreign policy issues that will make it harder to make good decisions in the future. It is my strong view that all policy is domestic. Decisions we take about somewhere else have direct or indirect repercussions back home. We might not feel them for a while, but we will, eventually, because crises begin somewhere, but they don't stay there. The effect of climate change on communities unable to stay in villages and towns where they've lived for centuries means people are on the move. The inability of so many countries to provide a safety net of provision means we have adults with no jobs, children with no schools, people with no food. War and crisis push people away from home. They are prepared to risk everything to find safety. And when you think of the crises I've described, it's probably no surprise that the number of people from Sudan who are now in Calais trying to get across the Channel has grown in the last few weeks. Our failure to help build economies means too that we lose potential opportunities for our own business to expand trade. Resources need to be spent on collaboration with law enforcement to deal with everything from people trafficking to terrorism, to keep us safe. And in all of these circumstances, that collaboration is essential. We can't achieve anything doing it on our own. We can't deal with climate change or pandemics, or make sure that we have good trade, or travel on holiday safely, or have the security we want. So the backdrop to all the challenges that we face internationally is that these directly affect every community in Britain and every one of us. Domestic policy is foreign policy, is domestic policy. So as this kaleidoscope starts to turn, well, let's think about what pieces are being thrown around. The most significant, in my view, is the multilateral order on which we have relied since the end of World War II. 1945, we created the United Nations. 1949, NATO and the Council of Europe. In 1951, the European Steel and Coal Community was created that led eventually to the European Union. And in 1975, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe came into being. All these big tankers of organizations who expected countries to sign on the line in their commitment to the values, the resources, the ideals and the ideas. Most importantly, in every case, their job was to find solutions and in doing that, to stick together. Heavy tankers, very difficult to maneuver, full of compromises, formed from seemingly endless discussions. And if you spent any time in Brussels, they were endless discussions. But they kept going, value-driven at their heart, offering protection of some kind. And they are all under attack. Global leadership is fragmenting. We saw for the first time the United States vote with Belarus, Russia, and North Korea at the United Nations on the subject of Ukraine. We saw before that 40 countries decide not to support resolutions on Ukraine at the General Assembly, not because they're all anti-democratic by any means, but because they saw their best interests being served by keeping relationships with different sides in the conflict. Why should they, African leaders will ask, be prepared to risk their own economic well-being for a war in Europe, when none of us can name all the wars, coups, and conflicts on their continent in the last years? Never mind demonstrate to them that we have shown the solidarity and support for the people affected. Our failures to engage with them, to understand their issues, will cost us. And it's already changed the relationships we once had. Arguably, when it comes to our colonial past, change for the better. But failing to translate relationships that we used to have to form a sort of mini tanker of the like-minded determined nations is a mistake. And it's one of the reasons we still have to keep thinking about aid and development. I understand very well in government that difficult decisions have to be made, and the decision that the British government took to cut aid in favour of defence is one that is understandable because, in terms of public opinion, it's easier. More's the pity. But the truth is now that China and, to an extent, Russia are rivals in determining what kind of economies, democracies, or autocracies we have in the future. They will fill the void. I don't speak of the human cost that goes alongside that. So as global leadership fixed in our tankers fades, we have to think about what the alternatives are. The yachts. Coalitions of the willing, put together for single purposes, fast in the water, able to get things done. Important, as we will see, for the future support of Ukraine, but insufficient for the longer term. We've still got to look after the organisations we created, give them a new coat of paint, scrape off the barnacles, and find new models to add to the options available to us, so that the kaleidoscope pieces settle, still with commitments to collaboration and common ideals, however far out of reach they might seem. Our greatest risk for the future, for the UK and way beyond, is that we won't achieve this. In its place will be strong men, strong-armed approaches with a transactional at best view of their interests, spheres of influence that don't protect fledgling democracies or developing nations, focus purely on the acquisition of beneficial deals and of money. All sound familiar echoes from the past as well, which is perhaps the greatest risk of all. And in a sense, at the heart of the concern, a United States that feels aggrieved by the past. President Trump is by no means the first president to ask Europe to pay more and get more involved in its own defense. If you look at the speeches of John F. Kennedy, he was far from quiet on this issue, demanding to know why the USA should have supplies able to allow for fighting for up to 90 days, while European forces in Europe only had enough for 3 days. He spoke eloquently and often on this subject, as has every president since, about the need for us to do more. President Obama made the same points at NATO summits that I attended. But perhaps President Trump channels the feelings of more Americans more directly. Or as a prominent American put it to me recently, why do you get to have Social Security, free healthcare and schools, and yet our tax dollars are spent on your defense? Arguably, Europe has not answered the call, believing ultimately that the United States would not desert us, and for many years, believing there was no crisis likely to create the need for a response from Europe on European soil. So as the kaleidoscope pieces fall into place, what will Europe do to protect itself? And Britain's efforts in ensuring the long-term planning for security and defence will matter and will play a significant role in what happens. But I mentioned too the 40 countries who did not vote with Ukraine in the UN General Assembly. While many of them are strong economically and politically, many of them come from regions where chaos is overwhelmingly attacking their neighbours, if not themselves, and tensions are rising, not least in the Middle East, where the horrors of October the 7th and the plight of hostages dominate the political horizon, with the terrible situation in Gaza and the rising conflict in the West Bank. It leaves, not least, the Arab nations of the region looking for answers that will solve a decades-old problem that only really has one solution, a two-state one, that seems further away than ever. The consequences for countries like Jordan and Lebanon in particular, with the tensions in Yemen, Iraq, and of course, Iran. The Houthi activity that we've seen in recent days creating havoc for shipping in Bab al-Mandab, which is known as the Gate of Tears, the shipping lane that goes between Yemen, Djibouti, and Eritrea, will have a direct impact on what happens in our economy. US strikes in the past 2 or 3 days point to the importance that the Americans realize in trying to tackle this. But countries in Africa too that I mentioned of the 40, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia and Eritrea, DRC, there are 35 armed conflicts in total. There are 20 in Asia, and the list goes on. In fact, one of the questions I invite you to ask each other later is, which country do you know that you regard today as stable, that you are confident completely will remain so, politically, economically, or militarily in the next 5 years? Instability has always been with us, but doesn't it feel like more is in flux at the moment? And we're watching different organizations being formed. Not my tankers and yachts, but those who come together for expedient reasons to simply improve their economies. The BRICS, or rather the BRICS Plus, is the best example. BRICS means Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. At first glance, a group of countries that don't have the same politics, the same values, that you might argue are at odds with each other. But they're not. They collaborate together. And the new countries, the plus part, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and most importantly now Nigeria, which means you've ended up with a group that is just over half of the world's population. The importance of these kind of groupings are not to be underestimated. Anyone who watched President Putin's press conference with his counterpart from Belarus, President Lukashenko, may have noticed that he mentioned the BRICS. He likes to do this. He likes to have organizations that he sees as equivalent. The customs union that he developed was, in his mind, with Kazakhstan, with hopefully he wanted Ukraine, though it didn't join, it was merely an observer, with Kazakhstan, with Belarus, was in his mind a way of countering the European Commission, a customs union, and Europe. And he said in that these countries were helping him or were thinking about what could be done in terms of Ukraine. These are seen almost in his mind, and certainly in the minds of others, as a potential alternative to the EU and the UN, to the Western established bodies. They're not asked to do anything except to be part of something. It's attractive. Where's the counter-proposal? What are we doing to put forward ideas that don't just feel tired, as so many countries feel what existed and already exists in our tankers is? And anyway, the leadership that has always developed these organizations was the United States. So countries will hedge their bets. They will move around and find things that suit their interests. And in a sense, how can you blame them? I focused much of what I've said, obviously, on structures to begin the conversation, but only as they represent the leadership that we've invested in or put up with, as some countries would feel. It was driven, as I said before, from the post-World War II settlement, and it's an expression of a statement simply put. And the statement was, never again. Institutions that offered guardrails, ideals, and action to protect and support the rights of people. Many countries, many communities, many individuals would point to the hypocrisy as they would see it. They would cite conflicts from Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, Syria, most recently Ukraine and the Middle East. Lots of countries who felt disappointed in what has happened in terms of leadership. And you hear it too from the people around the new president of the United States, those who don't have European roots or connections from the past, people who have roots in different parts of the world, who have different issues and concerns from South America, from Cuba, from countries where the issue was not about preventing fascism or communism, but societies that were not in step with what they wanted to achieve in business, in politics, in their personal ambitions and aspirations. So this collaborative model for them is not the model that they look to. They don't see it as providing for them. But as I always say to people, even when I am a passionate believer in the institutions and models that were created, I don't suffer from blinkered views of how marvellous they really are. When I became the first EU High Representative for foreign policy, I went to Moscow to have my first meeting with my counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who I knew would be pretty skeptical about the idea of the EU coming together to be able to operate with one voice. And I told him a joke, which I will now tell you, which was that when my position was created, the then Secretary of State, who happened to be Hillary Clinton, went to her boss, President Obama, and she said, "Good news, Mr. President. At last we have answered Kissinger's question. If we want to talk to Europe, who do we call?" And the president says to her, "That's fantastic, Hillary. What's the answer?" And she says, "You can call Cathy. Let's try her mobile and we'll be able to talk to Europe." So they dial my number and they get my voicemail. And it says, "Welcome to Europe. For the French position, press 1. For the German position, press 2. The point being that I'm not so blinkered in thinking that everything is marvellous in the institutional frameworks that we've created. But the idea that these structures may be in danger of collapse as we see disappointment and a lack of feeling that these institutions have worked for everyone, we risk alongside that the crises that I've talked about of people moving to avoid crisis themselves, to deal with the rise of disorder, of chaos, of terror. And what a funny world we find ourselves in when Canada becomes the enemy of the greatest power on earth. So if structures are failing, the number and severity of the crisis grows. Some are old problems that we failed to resolve in the endless game of whack-a-mole that you may remember as a child, where something pops up and you beat it, bash it down, and it pops up somewhere else. Was we try to move from one problem to another and resolve each. Limited resources is always a problem. An inadequate soft power diplomatic toolkit hasn't helped. Increasingly, there's little inside the diplomatic toolkit, except sanctions, which we've used effectively, but it's not the only thing that we should be trying to use. Because if problems take decades to bubble up and explode into conflict or chaos, we should not think that a few months of concerted action will sort them out. And as we know, the crisis of climate disaster, those have taken decades and more to emerge, with our full knowledge of the consequences, whatever the snake oil salesman reborn as climate deniers might say. So, in this, what does the UK do? How does it help the kaleidoscope to settle into a pattern that offers some solace, if not ultimate answers? Well, the first thing we need to do, and I think we are doing, is look around. There are still the like-minded, the coalitions of the willing, and the tankers still exist. They're slower, they're dirtier, they're heavier, but they're still there. So we should be a champion for what we know to be true. The importance of bringing together ideals and values in collaboration. We should tell the story of the narrative, if you like, of why democracy, freedom, and rights truly matter. And tell the story of strong economies who can navigate the world around them and support others on the same journey. Secondly, we need to decide to act. The biggest risk that we all face, in many ways, is doing nothing. And that's closely followed by doing something, but slowly. I'm often asked why, when I stood in Maidan in Kyiv in 2013, I didn't see what was going to happen in Ukraine. It's a fair question. In 2013, it didn't look like it looks now. It was a dispute about which way Ukraine wanted to face towards Europe, both in terms of its economic links, but also in terms of its institutional reform and its fight of corruption. It had a choice to face closer to Russia, but we were still in the world of not either or, but both and. We also thought that what we were dealing with was a weaker Russia, not interested in starting wars, a Russia that in the end would accept what a sovereign state, Ukraine, decided it wanted to do. It would make life uncomfortable, of course, but nothing more. By 2014, we saw the taking of Crimea, the incursions into the Donbass. We could see a little bit more of what was to come. But we still did not see that this could turn into something that would bring war to Europe for the first time since World War II. By the time I went to Ukraine in 2020 on a visit in February of that year, just before the pandemic took us all into lockdown, regular shelling by Russia in the Donbass was almost shrugged away by the international community, hardly making a statement from Brussels or London or Washington, D.C., and certainly not meriting action. So doing nothing doesn't help. It means deciding to engage early enough to stop a problem becoming a crisis that will engulf and envelop so many of us. It means, too, for the UK deciding what relationship they want with Brussels. Time moves on, and Europe has moved on. And we can't afford to stand still and hope we can resolve problems later. The engagement that we're now seeing across Europe with UK leadership is so important on defence, on security, and indeed on foreign policy. It's really important. But it's insufficient when what we know we have to do here is grow the economy, making sure that that will enable us to spend more on defence, to restore the aid budget, and answer the frustrations of our population, so often let down, who fear their own future, and more importantly, the future for their children. Third, the UK needs to think long term. I always say to people that those who excavated the monuments across the world, from the pyramids to Notre Dame, did so in the knowledge that they would not see the finished product. So too, with repairing and making long-lasting change across the world. Diplomacy is a drip, drip, drip business. It takes years, sometimes decades, sometimes longer, if you're going to seriously make lasting change. You have to stick with it. Nothing happens quickly. Sometimes things happen really slowly. I always joke that when the Americans decided to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, it was 4.5 years of my life I will never get back. It's important that we do this work with purpose and with determination to find answers. Sometimes it's not just about the money that you put in. When I went to Haiti in the earthquake of 2010 to see this shattered country where 95% of buildings in the center had been destroyed and 235,000 people died in 35 seconds. I couldn't find the 5% that hadn't been destroyed. But more importantly, I saw a really poor country, despite it having been in receipt of aid from the United Nations since the early 1950s. And when you look at how we are able to use resources, what you often discover is it's not just the money, it's a system, the way that the country is organized, the opportunities that people need to have. It's all of the stuff that we know that creates the best possible society, from education to a justice system, to the democracy that you create, to the ability of communities to be able to be proud and rise up in terms of what they're able to offer their own people. Rethinking why it is that communities fail to prosper, tackling organized crime and gangs, bringing investment that will hang around rather than come and go. There is a litany of well-known but not always well-used elements to how you develop a society and how you move societies and countries from failure to at least the potential for success. And fourth, I think, for British foreign policy, we need to make sure we look after our own backyard. Not just our relationships with Europe, but Europe's backyard too. One of my particular passions is the Western Balkans, places like Serbia and Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and all of those nations that are so significantly challenged. North Macedonia has just been in the headlines because of the terrible fire that has taken the lives of so many young people. But these are small countries that need to feel a future that is going to bring them closer to us and enable them to get beyond the wars of the past in the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. But you see the challenges that they are facing and how difficult and complicated their own politics is and becomes. This is somewhere where British foreign policy can engage and make a difference. But my final and perhaps biggest challenge of all is to decide who we are and where we fit. The bridge that we have traditionally played between the United States and Europe is in one sense harder to play because we're not in the EU, and easier to play because we are not in the EU, a bloc that President Trump believes is there to put up barriers and costs for the United States. We are a leading defence player, as I've already mentioned. Some speculation in the press of late that we are even Russia's #1 enemy. So the direction of travel is pretty laid out for us in those areas. We are doing a bit of dodging and weaving and creating the best and strongest possible links with both to be a valued and valuable partner able to interpret in each direction without getting run over from both directions. It's not an easy role to play, but actually so far so good. The rest of the world is a bit more challenging. Rebuilding relationships that I've mentioned before is not easy when you don't necessarily have the resources to be able to do it. But demonstrating leadership is really important. We have a track record of which we can rightly be proud, and we remain a country that many others look to for help or even guidance. We mustn't squander it, and now is the time to really use it. So I would argue time to build some more yachts, bring together leaders, regions in support of specific goals, maybe even bigger than a yacht, a sort of cargo ship that we can add some weight to. Helping countries who are drawn towards agreements or relationships that are not about the pursuit of democracy and freedom and human rights by explaining to them and showing them that there are alternatives, and not forgetting to support and retain the tankers that we have already created. They were made from a time when we understood the horrors and destruction that could be wreaked across a continent. We've seen different versions of that, maybe in smaller ways across the world ever since. it's not likely that we could start to build new versions of these in this particular time. So it really is about bringing together those willing to engage, of whom there are many, for lots of different reasons. So as the kaleidoscope pieces fall, we need to push them into new patterns, keeping them turning until they start to form the strong shapes, fit for the landscape that will look different in a world that in a few years' time we will see has changed. Thank you very much.